In this demo, we will look into using vendor-specific media types for input. We're going to implement the use case we saw on the slide. So the first thing to do is add a date of that for an author on the author entity. There we go. And let's add a migration for that. So we open the Package Manager console and we execute the add migration command and give the migration a name. There we go. Let's execute that migration. Executing the migration isn't strictly necessary because, as you know, whenever we start our project again, the complete database is rebuilt, and that includes migrations being run. However, if you do want to manually execute the migration, you can always execute an update database command. And that did the trick. Then we need a DTO with a date of that field, which will potentially be used when creating an author. So let's add a new class to the models folder. Author for creation with date of that DTO. It contains all the fields an author for creation DTO contains, so we let it derive from that, and it adds one additional field, the date of that. Before we forget, let's change the way we calculate the age. There's a datetime offset extensions class in the helpers folder. It contains a getCurrentAge method. Currently, that doesn't take the date of that into account. So let's change that. This time, the getCurrentAge method, which is an extension method on datetime offset, allows passing through a date of that. If that is passed through, it is taken into account when calculating the age. Let's open the author's profile. And let's make sure we pass through the date of that when calculating the age. There we go. We also add a new map. So our author for creation with date of that DTO model can be mapped to an author entity. And that's it for our database and calculation. Let's save all of this and let's have a look at the create author action on our authors controller. We seem to have an issue. We need to be able to, depending on the content type header value, either accept an author for creation DTO or an author for creation with date of that DTO. The type must be passed through in the action signature, so we can't just easily do that with one action. We need an additional one. So let's add one. For now, we'll just copy over our current method and change the name and input parameters. So let's name it create author with date of that, and let's have it accept an author for creation with date of that DTO. The rest of the method doesn't have to change. In a real-life scenario, the body of these actions would or could contain different code, obviously. For our sample, this will do. But we do have to somehow differentiate between these actions. And how we want to differentiate, so the discriminator here, is the value of the content type header. So depending on the value passed through, we should either end up in the create author with date of that or the create author action. And that is where action constraints come into play. These allow us to select an action depending on, for example, the content type header. In other words, with such a constraint, we won't even hit the wrong action, meaning we can nicely separate them. Let's do that. Let's add a new folder, Action Constraints, and let's add a new class to it. We'll name the class Request Header Matches Media Type Attribute. This is going to be our action constraint attribute. So we want it to derive from attribute. And implement the iActionConstraint interface. For that, we need to import the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.ActionConstraints namespace. As far as the usage of this attribute is concerned, inherited is set to true, and we want to allow multiple instances of these. Let's add a constructor. We want to accept the request header to match and the media types that will result in a match. First thing to do is check the input here. If no request header to match was inputted, we throw an argument null exception. If there is, we store it in a private read-only string field. Then we need to parse the media types that result in a match. We want to store them in a collection so we can use them afterwards. There's a collection type available for that out of the box, a media type collection, defined in Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.formatters. Then we check if the inputted media types are valid media types. We know how to do that. We can use the media type header value class for that. Again, be careful here. Make sure you import the Microsoft.net.http.headers namespace. If one of the media types isn't the valid media types, we cannot continue, so we throw an exception. When parsing is successful, we want to add it to the media type collection. And then we do the exact same thing for potential additional media types that have been passed through. These are stored in the other media types array. And that's it for the setup. Now let's implement that iActionConstraint interface. We should provide implementations for order and accept. The order property decides which stage the constraint is part of. Action constraints run in groups based on the order. We don't need to do anything with this for our use case, so a simple getter is sufficient. The accept method returns a boolean. If we want the route we apply this constraint to be matched, it should return true and otherwise false. The context gives us access to information about the request routing. The first thing we want to get from that are the request headers. We want to check if the request header to match contains one of the media types as values. So we get the current headers. Once we've got the correct header, we can get the value of it. And that value, that's one or more media types. We are currently assuming that one media type will be set. And what we want to check for this is whether it matches one of the media types passed in when setting up this attribute. If that is true, we return true. Otherwise, we return false. And that's it for our custom action constraint attribute. Then on to the authors controller. Our create author action should stay as is, but it should only be executed when application.json or application vnd.marvin.author for creation plus JSON are content type values. That's what we can use our newly created action constraint for. So let's import the course library.api.actionConstraints namespace so this resolves again. Our newly created create author with date of that action should accept a new media type when the pass-through media type for content type is our author for creation with date of that media type. Lastly, we also need to specify which media types our actions can consume. Just like there's a produces attribute to restrict what an action can produce, there's a consumes attribute to constrict what an action can consume. So this has to do with the media types for the input formatter. That is different from our request header matches media type constraint, because that ensures routing to an action is allowed or blocked. It doesn't have anything to do with an input or output formatter. So we do need both of these attributes. Let's add a consumes attribute to the create author action, and that should be it. Let me put a breakpoint in these actions so we can see whether we are effectively routed to the correct one. And let's give this a try. We're back in Postman. The first request we're going to send is one to create an author with application JSON as content type header. So that is one without a date of that. Let's click send. And we indeed end up in the create author action. So far, so good. Then let's try creating an author with content type vnd.marvin.author for creation plus JSON. This again is an author without a date of that, and that means we should again end up in the create author action. And that is indeed the case. Lastly, let's try creating an author with a date of that. So the request body contains a date of that, and as content type header value, we have our custom vendor-specific author for creation with date of that media type. Let's send this. And there we go. This time we end up in our create author with date of that action. The author has been created. And have a look at the age of the author. Apparently it's 60. Let's have a look at what we sent. If we take the date of birth and date of death into account, this is indeed an author who reached the age of 60. So here we go. This works as expected. And now we've got an action constraint, we can also improve our getAuthor method. Let's do that next.